Okay, we're going to get started. This is Cross-Platform Learner Analytics with Open edX and xAPI with Bryan Wilson from AppSembler.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a developer at AppSembler, so I'm coming at this a bit more from a developer approach. I'm not an xAPI expert or an analytics expert. I am curious to know who in the room kind of knows what xAPI is or even has worked with it. Okay, about almost half-ish, 40%. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about something that we have developed to get xAPI events out of learner activities in the LMS and get them into a learning record store. So I'll jump into more of that. Okay, so probably by now you've been to at least one talk on analytics, and obviously people are doing a lot of interesting work around that area, and we have edX Insights answering questions like, who are my learners, what are they doing to engage with my course, and how well is my content serving them? So you might wonder why another analytics tool. Well, obviously Insights is a pretty powerful tool, but it's not really real time, and it's based on analysis of the tracking logs, which is not really an interoperable standard. So one thing to mention is xAPI is it's not the new SCORM. It's similar if you have some experience to SCORM, but the big name of the game, for me anyway, is interoperability, like I mentioned. So some people in this room may have Open edX installs. They may be using Canvas. They may be using, who knows, Moodle, or wanting to work with data from in-person classroom experiences, or really anywhere that a learner might be doing things. So xAPI helps with the story of interoperability between Open edX and other solutions. And one of the big ways it does this is by encouraging and to some extent enforcing shared vocabularies. You might have heard the term Tin Can API, and that was an early name for it, but Experience API is what it stands for now. Kind of some basics about it. It stores statements in a consistent structured format. Like I mentioned, one of the key features is controlled and extensible vocabularies. These are vocabularies for a domain. A domain might be online learning with an LMS, for example. And xAPI also provides a REST-based way to get and store and also query about statements and the data that they represent. So we'll get into some of the specifics. I do want to mention edX actually is working on a story for using xAPI, also Caliper, to get real-time data out of the LMS. And it's particularly to respond to some of the needs around adaptive learning. So there's an OEP, Open edX proposal, number 26. And you can go read it. It's been accepted. It's in provisional phase, provisional state. And it's supposed to support cross-LMS integrations. And also, these are sort of secondary to the supporting adaptive learning pathways. And as well, also to be able to send out some information to some of their enterprise clients about really high interest learner activities. So I'm more aware of the effort and have been in communication. I'm not sure if there's a targeted release, but essentially it would be something, my understanding is it would go into the core of the LMS and work to basically take an event that would be in the tracking logs, and there would be a real-time handler for that event. There'd be some filtering, maybe not every event is something that is of interest. Translate to xAPI, validate that it's proper xAPI, and then route to a learning record store. And if some of these are terms that are new to you, we'll get into it a little bit. Again, I'm not quite sure when it will be ready, but in the meantime, so AppSimilar is working with InterSystems Corporation, and so they had a need. They use Moodle, the Totara LMS. They also work with virtual labs. So they're training on some software, mostly related to the healthcare industry, and they want to get some information about what students are doing in those contexts as well, and then be able to analyze all of that together. So xAPI being an open standard, they asked us to kind of jump ahead of the curve a little bit and help them get information into their learning record store so they could start analyzing the same learners across all of those activities and all of those platforms. So we needed a solution right away for Open edX. So this is, there's a GitHub repo with what we have. It's available. So it's an external service that runs on the app server that has the LMS and generally Studio as well. It takes tracking log events out of Open edX, translates them to xAPI statements, sends them to a learning record store. That's kind of the basic path. So if you're not familiar, and some of you may have just been to Dan's talk from Pearson, but so much of the things that a learner would do are tracked in what's called the tracking log. So that can come from either the browser, the client side, or the server side. And it's a very verbose, very detailed record of things that go on with learner activity in Open edX. So our solution kind of sits after those are generated. So just to give a little context, Learning Record Store, essentially it's a data store for xAPI statements. The xAPI spec kind of tells how a learning record store must behave, must respond to someone trying to put in a statement or query about a statement, make sure that the statements are actual valid xAPI. So they're network accessible. They store data in the JSON format. They validate. And many of them have their own built-in analytics tools and can even forward statements to other learning record stores as well. So some examples are Learning Locker, Callisto, Watershed, and Rustici LRS. InterSystems was using Learning Locker. It's open source. They do have some paid editions. And it's pretty easy to get started with. I have some links at the end. You can use Amazon AMI. There's also a Docker image as well for that. And they're multi-tenant, so basically your credentials control what record store you can query from and save to, and there's some levels of access there. You can also kind of get into, if you want some pretty advanced querying, using MongoDB-based queries. Okay, so that would be sort of how a statement would look in the learning record, sort of at the basis. I'm going to do a quick demo. Hopefully everything will work out okay, and we can see how using the tool we've set up, some activities that I will take on a demo Open edX instance might get recorded in a learning record store. So bear with me 1 second. Oops, trying to get you to see this screen. Well, I probably have to close my presentation. All right, so this is just a Vagrant server that I have running Open edX. So I'm going to just start up the process here. And so I'm just telling it to look at the tracking log that's going to be generated. Some debug output, and so it's telling us that it's watching what's going on here. Okay, probably recognize this. So I'm just going to basically click around, do a few things. So here I am, I'm logged in as Bryan with a bunch of weird characters just because I was testing Unicode. So I can take some navigation actions. I can play this video. I can skip ahead, go here, stop. Maybe I'll answer a question. Oops, let me clear my state here, start over. And I think I'll be a good student and get it correct. Okay, so I've done a few things. And now you can see, so I've got a bunch of activity here that is, a lot to look at, but you can start to see some things like succeed ascending statement, something that looks like answered, that looks familiar, a description, a problem in an Open edX course, name checkboxes, and there's my email address and my weird name. And so a bunch of these things happen. You can see this produced, I guess, 11, 12 some statements. And then I will go into Learning Locker. And so this is inside. I've logged into our instance of Learning Locker, and you can see a bunch of examples already. Just do a refresh here. Okay, so some of my things show up. So a couple minutes ago, I played, I forwarded, I played, I paused, I went to a new section, standard problems, went to a new tab, attempted, answered, and answered checkboxes, and this thing I can't seem to get rid of, but that's just always in there for some reason. Anyway, so I will go back to my presentation. Sorry, 1 minute. Bear with me 1 sec. Sorry. Give me 1 sec. I think I'll just mirror my screen so I'm not fiddling around with this. Okay, we're back. All right, so I'll just walk you through kind of what a xAPI statement entails. You probably started to get the sense there's sort of an actor, a verb. So who did what, to what. And context, just some more information. What happened, a result, and then everything has a timestamp. There's some more things like a unique ID and that kind of thing, but oops. So the statements they're unique, they're unchangeable, but they can be voided after the fact if that needs to happen. So I won't spend too long on this code view, but again, actor, verb, object, context. So here you see I have an actor who's identified by a mailbox, a verb, this long string adlnet.gov exp API verbs initialized, an object, which you can see is called course unit tab. It's described by a type that has a unique URL ID, and some extensions there. And there's a context, you see a little bit of it, the platform, so sort of fake openedx.ucsd.edu. Looking a little bit more closely at those. So each actor needs to be uniquely identified, and you can do that with an email address, which edX is not going that direction. That's personally identifiable information. Or you can go with, probably what will happen is an anonymized user ID. In our case, our client wanted the email address to be able to match people. So these verbs are what are part of this shared vocabulary. So, and this is kind of where the power of xAPI comes in. So as long as you standardize on vocabulary that is shared amongst your domain, online learning, or there may be specific domains within that, a vocabulary for a physics course or geology course, that kind of a thing, or specific to, say, the domain of consuming video content. As long as you are standardizing on that and working, with a community to either develop a new standard, and edX I think is going to be jumping into that space to some extent, or using what is already there, then it really gives you a lot of ability to compare across platforms. And so there's something, a roll-up of a vocabulary is called a profile. And again, it's based around a community of practice, and there's a common, you can see at the bottom, there's a GitHub repo which is kind of the place that a lot of the profiles in use are stored, and then there's another URL there for one that's a bit more granular or I should say more browsable. So an object, might have an ID that looks like that from an OpenEdX site. And these are the things this is the JSON format parts of a statement. Context can, from OpenEdX, it can be a problem that's within a section that has a URL, and a course that has a URL, and a platform that has a URL. So you can gather a lot of context about where this activity took place. And then a result. For a problem, it might have a score, or in some cases, you might be watching a video, and the result is that you scanned through the video, and the result was moving from one time to another. And that's done, with extensions that are from this video namespace. So basically, our approach, like I said, is to watch the tracking log, read the event, decide whether it's something that we care about, build an xAPI statement, queue some statements together, and then send them to the LRS, like Learning Locker. I showed you a little bit in the console. This is sort of the bare bones of it. It uses iNotify in the background to just watch the new entries come into the tracking log, and has some handling for when that log file gets rotated, for example. This is part of a tracking log event. So these are, you might have seen some of these. So this is particular to edX. So somebody enrolled in a course on edX. So edX records this edX.course.enrollment.activated. So in our solution, we need to figure out whether that's something that we care about or not. And then translate it to xAPI. So there's a library, a Python library called the Tin Can Python that we're making use of and extending. So these get turned into using some classes from that package into a way to send statements, and then that Tin Can Python provides a lot of the lower level tools for communicating with the LRS, validating xAPI, and then gives you some base classes to add things that you care about or make it easier to add on. So there'll be a little Python here. So we have kind of a base class for an LMS tracking log statement, and it does some things like it populates some of the user info to identify by going out and making a call to the user API from the LMS. Adds a timestamp, and then we might have some more particular statement types that are, so this is about a course. And in this case, like any activity about a course, so that would most likely be an enrollment or an unenrollment as far as what we've handled. And a course is a kind of activity. It's not an actor like I would be or as a person. And again, the course is sort of the object. And the event, which is more like the verb, so we have some, we have this course enrollment statement, and we match this, we build the xAPI verb and add it to our statement, and so we have some configuration that says, okay, like a course enrollment statement in the xAPI world is this ADLNet xAPI verbs registered. And so this is true of a lot of parts of how the statements are built and sent, that we've got some configuration that says, well, this is the profile, this is the URL, sorry, this is the URL from the vocabulary that we're using to identify and sort of match the edX tracking log ID to the xAPI vocabulary that we're trying to use. So we kind of developed this in a few phases. This edX API bridge was based on some unmaintained work from 3-4 years ago from ADLNet, but I was grateful to have that as a starting point. So we just started off trying to see, hey, can we get some statements into a learning record store? And we tried it out. You know, there are a few issues, some hard-coded URLs in there, some non-standard vocabularies, some older vocabularies than what are in use today. Second step was adding, just sort of doing a pretty big rewrite using this Tin Can Python library that came along. So it's going to make it a lot more maintainable, standardized on a new profile, and then that's when we added in the user info. And then we've recently completed a third phase just to make this more performance ready. So we looked at making sure we have some monitoring and error handling in place, and that the configuration could be repeatable. So there is an Ansible role that can be used to install and configure this service. Right now, it's actually in a configuration repo. There's a link at the end that's for Ficus, but I think it should be usable by probably at up through Hawthorne at least. So some of the things that we did is added some caching and did some load testing, and it's able to handle a pretty high volume of statements. And again, it's pretty verbose what comes out of edX, so it needs to be able to do that. And so one of the things we wanted to look at in terms of kind of how we handle running this is that we would rather just sort of keep track of if there's a problem sending a statement to the back, but keep going. so we're not bringing the whole service down just in case there's one error, like the username can't be found, or because it got deleted in the meantime, or something like that. So we have some monitoring set up, and error handling, and if you're using Sentry, like we were sending some additional context to the back so you can see what the tracking log event was that was associated with it, and some detail from like any error message that comes back from the LRS. But basically just tries to keep going as much as possible, but let us know if there's an issue. But if it goes down, we need to bring it right back up because of a high volume usage. You could be missing a lot of data. So we've got it set up as a system service, unlike what I just showed you on my demo. So there's some auto restart in place. Yeah, so that's kind of what we have for a system. I think it's ready to go. It's in production now. Some of the challenges we came across was the tracking log events don't have a lot of detail that we would be interested in some case just the name of things. So that's why you saw a course unit tab and course name and things like that. So there's some extra steps. Either those event emitters need to be changed, or we have to go get that from an additional API in the LMS. But for now, it's suiting our purposes. Also just making sure, like we're noticing that the statements that this client's getting coming in from Moodle and Totara are organized a little bit differently, and we need to figure out how to map. We're not quite using the same vocabulary in some cases, but so there can be a process of mapping from one to the other that can happen either in the LRS or possibly with some extensions in our system. A lot of you might be familiar with Caliper as well, which is another standard. I mentioned at the end, edX is looking to handle those emit Caliper events from real-time from tracking logs as well. So it'll be interesting to look ahead and see how best to handle people using one or both. Or so some next steps, I'd be interested in adding some additional context about an action like who's the instructor, what cohort are they in, handle group agents. All the ones I did was just me as an individual student making those actions, but xAPI has concepts around a group of users doing something together. More multilingual support, additional validation. So yeah, if there's any xAPI experts here that are interested in participating, that would be awesome. And just some more stability things, handle multiple backend LRSs, maybe switch to Celery for queuing and more tests. Yeah, like I said, contact me if you're interested. I've got a bunch of links when the slides are available just to find things that I've talked about. This is including edX's proposal to OEP and their sort of vocabulary that they're using. They have a Google spreadsheet that you can go look at. xAPI specs, info about Learning Locker and how to get that going and how to work with it. And then just thanks to Amisha and Bryan, same name, Bryan Wilson at edX, who worked on their portion. There's another developer at AppSembler, Nishant Dixit, and Valerie, who helped with our project. And Nishant actually developed a lot of the sort of server stability portions of things. And Kim Kohler and Doug Foster at InterSystems for funding the effort and being interested, and the Open edX community. And so if there's questions, be happy to take them.
How does the analytic tools works? You mentioned one of the analytic tools. Is it because it's looking just like a query on the database, but And my second question, how can you make inference on, suppose you have a video and after a quiz and you want to know how much of the relationship between the video and how the students succeed after having seen the video, how the analytic enable this?
Okay, so the questions were basically how you do the analytics part and the querying of the xAPI data, right? And then so more specifically about how to, like for example, if somebody has watches a video and then takes a quiz to find the relationship between those things. I'm not the best person to ask because I'm not really a data scientist or a learning researcher. More sort of my role has been getting the data out to where that can be examined. But there are a bunch of tools I could show you real quickly. There's just even within Learning Locker, there are some tools for querying. I don't know if you saw it when we went by, just there, yeah, like you can, that's just some really basic things that you can just do right through the interface, just sort of asking, filtering by who, what, where, when, why, sort of along how that's recorded in the statements. And then the Learning Locker itself has some advanced querying also through the interface, probably for the use case that you're saying. You can look at the context of both the video and the quiz and relate them that way. You could look at, obviously, same user. You might care about, timestamps and how long that's has been in between.
Do you know if the context is logged? So suppose I have a X block or a section of my course, Open edX course. Do in the event are the the place and the tree of the course logged in the event?
Yes, for sure.
Okay.
So you can. It'll be interesting. I don't know if you went to the block store talk, but to see how we would need to adapt this kind of approach where context can be, might include a bit more mix and match of the content. But yes, you can add quite a bit. Yeah, course section. You run or all that info is there.
Somewhat in mind with the previous talk where we discuss real-time analytics and things like that and feedback to the student, is there any thought about how edX is going to reach into an LRS to retrieve information using xAPI perhaps, to display some statistics for the student?
Yeah, so I mentioned that as far as I know, the primary use case is to drive adaptive learning, and my understanding is they're looking at real-time sending of xAPI as sort of the data engine for that, and so And so that is meant to be round trip back to the student. So, obviously there's kind of a black box there around sort of what happens in the analytics and what they decide to do with that. But I think the interesting thing is that is using an open standard like xAPI to do that, as opposed to sticking with the kind of more specific edX tracking log standard itself. And there may be other technical reasons as well why they've chosen that, but I'm not quite sure. But maybe ask Namisha. Yeah.
Are the tracking logs the sole source of information for constructing these xAPI events?
In our implementation, it is, yeah. So it's basically that's what kind of the best route forward right now without sort of trying to implement something on our own that's kind of making modifications like it would need to all over the LMS. So that it's sort of a way of us to keep it as a fairly separate and clean implementation, kind of while we're waiting to see what's going to come. But
So what kind of implications does that have for, like, say if you wanted to use this, there's some dependencies on like where your tracking log file gets spit out. You might have to run this on the same machine.
yes, it does have to be on the same machine right now. But that's it's an area I'd be interested to look in. If, right now we don't have a particular like need to support that, but if there's other people in the community that would like to use this and need to support it, definitely would be interested in talking.
Hey, good talk. If the service goes down, the bridge goes down, and it's not able to convert the tracking log events to the Experience API. So, what are the implications on that? You're doing real-time analytics and I guess reporting on that. Can you just talk a little more about that? If you were down and you lose those events.
Yeah, our strategy right now is, so the events don't disappear from the tracking logs. Where it has gone down, we're at the point where it's pretty much stable. For a while, we're trying to figure out. I was banging my head against, oh yeah, of course, the log rotation. That's why it keeps going down or stopping handling. Essentially, our strategy for right now, because it's relatively low volume, is a manual intervention, sort of rerun the process on what we know to have been missed. So, I mean, that's not awesome, but yeah, I'd be interested in sort of figuring out a secondary queue of, we know we missed these and we need to go back and rehandle, but we haven't got that far yet.
So I guess this goes to another notion. If you set the bridge up at a later point and you've been running your instance for several years, would you go back and manually convert all those tracking events to Experience API data?
Oh, kind of backfilling?
Yeah, backfilling.
You could, yeah. I mean, you can just point it at a file that's kind of how the load testing was done. I just sort of kept writing to a fake tracking log file, and I mean, it'd be any file that it is in that format, so you could, yeah.
Hold on, just for the recording. That's okay.
Well, yeah, so you said does it dedupe? Do you want to add more?
I was just wondering, so if you do end up having to reprocess logs, does the receiving system deduplicate the records that you're sending?
Well, how so? How do you, like?
So if you end up reprocessing the same tracking events multiple times, you'll end up with multiple records in the system that are basically exactly the same.
They actually would get rejected by the LRS, so you would end up with a whole lot of like warnings in your error tracking system, but they wouldn't get in because of the xAPI standard wouldn't allow, because it would have the same exact timestamp and get rejected.
Any other questions?
Good?
Yeah. Thanks again to Bryan, and hope everyone had a great 2 days.
Thank you.